October 15, 2008. Rafael Mendoza had been feeding Fidel Castro's secrets to the CIA for 3 years. The man Castro called mi hijo, my son. That's exactly why the Langley handlers paid him $2 million to steal the revolution's crown jewel, Castro's private office. 2:47 a.m. Rafael opened the safe, photographed Operation Mongoose files, and uploaded everything to an encrypted server. 17 resistance cells. 17 resistance cells. 234 names, families who'd hidden dissidents for decades. What happened in the next 12 hours became the most classified betrayal in Cold War history. The State Department held emergency meetings because of it, and for 11 years, when Cuban exiles talked about their escape from Castro's Cuba, they never knew they owed their freedom to this moment. The night Rafael Mendoza stole Fidel Castro's revolution, the night he thought he'd escaped his past forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The encrypted upload finished at 2:51 a.m. Rafael's hands trembled as he closed the safe, the metallic click echoing like a gunshot in Castro's private office. 4 minutes. That's all it had taken to destroy everything he'd sworn to protect. Outside, Havana slept under a blanket of oppressive humidity and revolutionary dreams. Inside, Rafael Mendoza, Castro's most trusted intelligence officer, the man who'd shared cigars and strategy sessions for 15 years, wiped sweat from his forehead with the same hands that had just photographed state secrets. The files were already racing through encrypted channels toward Langley, Operation Mongoose's resurrection plans. The names of every deep-cover asset Castro had embedded in Miami's exile community. Most damning of all, the locations of 17 resistance cells that had been feeding information to the CIA through a network Castro didn't know existed. Rafael had just signed their death warrants. His secure phone buzzed. A text from his CIA handler Marcus Webb package received. Exfiltration in 6 hours. Marina Hemingway, slip 47. 6 hours to maintain the performance of a lifetime. 6 hours to sit across from Castro at their morning briefing and discuss crushing the very resistance network Rafael had spent 3 years secretly protecting. 6 hours to look into the eyes of the man who'd called him son and pretend he hadn't just committed the ultimate betrayal. Rafael moved through Castro's office like a ghost, ensuring every detail remained exactly as he'd found it. The Revolucionario's reading glasses folded on his desk, the half-empty glass of rum, the photograph of Che Guevara watching from the wall with those penetrating eyes that had haunted Cuba's conscience for decades. What would Che think of this moment, Rafael wondered. Would the great revolutionary understand that sometimes betrayal was the only path to salvation? The irony wasn't lost on him. Rafael Mendoza had joined Castro's revolution as a teenager, believing in the promise of a free Cuba. 28 years later, he was destroying it from within to create the very freedom the revolution had failed to deliver. But the families hiding in Miami's shadows, the ones whose names were scattered across those photographed documents, they deserved more than revolutionary promises. They deserved to live without fear of Castro's reach extending across the 90 miles of ocean that separated oppression from opportunity. Rafael slipped out of the office and walked the corridors of power he'd navigated for nearly 3 decades. Every step carried the weight of irreversible choice. In 6 hours, he would disappear forever. Rafael Mendoza, Castro's most trusted son, would cease to exist. The morning briefing felt like an eternity compressed into 30 minutes. Castro discussed plans to infiltrate the latest wave of refugee boats attempting the crossing to Florida. He spoke passionately about revolutionary duty, about protecting Cuba from American imperialism, about the sacred trust between brothers in the struggle. Rafael nodded at appropriate moments, offered tactical suggestions, and felt his soul fragment with each word. When Castro placed a paternal hand on his shoulder and said, "Rafael, mi hijo, what would we do without your loyalty?" the answer nearly escaped his lips. "You're about to find out." At 8:43 a.m., Rafael walked out of government headquarters for the last time. His resignation letter, carefully crafted to suggest personal exhaustion rather than betrayal, would be discovered that afternoon. By then, he would be aboard a CIA extraction vessel, watching Cuba's coastline shrink into memory. Marina Hemingway buzzed with its usual morning activity: fishermen preparing boats, tourists planning excursions, locals selling fresh catches from the night's work. Raphael approached Slip 47, where a modest fishing charter waited, its captain nodding almost imperceptibly. As the boat pulled away from shore, Raphael felt the weight of his choice settle into his bones. Behind him, Cuba held everything he'd ever known: his childhood, his revolutionary youth, his rise through the intelligence ranks, his relationship with the man who'd shaped a nation's destiny. Ahead lay exile, protection, and a new identity funded by the $2 million the CIA had deposited in a Cayman Islands account. Ahead lay the knowledge that 17 resistance cells would continue their work because of his betrayal. Ahead lay the certainty that dozens of families in Miami would sleep safer tonight because Rafael Mendoza had chosen their freedom over his own loyalty. The boat reached international waters at 10:15 a.m. Raphael looked back one final time at the island that had defined his existence. Cuba shimmered in the Caribbean heat like a mirage, already becoming part of his past rather than his present. He thought about Castro discovering the betrayal, imagined the rage and hurt that would consume the man who'd trusted him like a son. But this wasn't about personal relationships anymore. This was about the larger betrayal, Castro's betrayal of his own people's dreams, his betrayal of the revolution's original promise. Sometimes, Raphael told himself as Cuba disappeared into the horizon, the greatest act of loyalty was betrayal itself. What Raphael didn't know was that Castro had suspected him for months. What he couldn't imagine was that his escape had been allowed, part of a deeper game that wouldn't reveal itself for 11 years. If you're following this story of deception within deception, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's chapter reveals the trap Castro set that took more than a decade to spring. 11 years later, Rafael Mendoza, now Robert Martinez according to his meticulously crafted documents, stood on the stern of Libertad, watching the sun paint Key West's harbor in shades of amber and gold. The irony of his boat's name hadn't escaped him when he'd christened her 6 years ago: freedom. Such a simple word for something that had cost him everything he'd ever been. The morning ritual remained unchanged: coffee black as Cuban soil, cigarette burning between weathered fingers, eyes scanning the horizon where the Gulf Stream carried both fish and memories. At 62, Raphael's hands bore the honest calluses of charter boat work, a deliberate choice to bury the smooth palms of an intelligence officer beneath layers of salt and rope burn. "Morning, Bobby," Maria Santos called from the neighboring slip, her voice carrying the musical accent of second-generation exile. She was securing Lines 1 Esperanza, her family's boat that had carried refugees from Mariel to Key West in 1980. Maria's father, Eduardo, emerged from the cabin with his usual grunt of acknowledgement. "Fish are running," Eduardo said, his weathered face creased into what passed for a smile. "Saw the birds working about 8 miles out yesterday." Raphael nodded, stubbing out his cigarette. These people, this small community of Cuban Americans who'd found sanctuary in Key West's embrace, had become his world. They didn't know that Robert Martinez had once sat in secret meetings planning their capture. They didn't know their neighbor had personally signed orders targeting exile operations. To them, he was simply another refugee who'd found his way to safety. The guilt never left. It lived in his chest like a stone, growing heavier each time Eduardo shared stories of his escape, each time Maria spoke of cousins still trapped in Havana, each time the exile community gathered for memorial services honoring those who hadn't survived the crossing. "You okay, Bobby?" Maria's voice carried genuine concern. At 43, she'd inherited her father's fierce protectiveness and her mother's intuitive warmth. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Every morning, Raphael thought. "Every morning I see ghosts. Just tired," he said instead. "Coffee hasn't kicked in yet." Eduardo climbed onto the dock, his movements still spry despite 74 years of defying Castro's revolution. "We're heading out around 9 if you want company. Tourists aren't coming until afternoon." Raphael appreciated the offer, but solitude served him better. Alone on the water, he could stop performing. Stop being Robert Martinez, the quiet charter captain with the mysterious past that no one questioned too closely. Key West attracted drifters and refugees, people escaping histories they preferred not to discuss. His silence fit the landscape. The morning proceeded with familiar rhythm. Raphael checked Libertad's engine, a rebuilt diesel that purred like a contented cat, tested the radio, organized tackle for the afternoon's charter. A family from Ohio, the booking had said. Father wanting to teach his teenage sons about fishing. Simple, clean, no complications. As he worked, muscle memory occasionally betrayed him. His hands would move in patterns learned 30 years ago, checking for surveillance, identifying exit routes, cataloging potential threats. Old habits of an intelligence officer died hard, especially when survival had depended on them for so long. Around 10 a.m., the charter families began arriving. The Hendersons from Cincinnati clustered near the tackle shop, all sunscreen and enthusiasm. Raphael watched them through Libertad's cabin window, noting the father's protective positioning near his children, the mother's careful scan of the docks. Even civilians possessed instincts that had kept humanity alive for millennia. Captain Martinez? The voice belonged to a young woman, perhaps 25, with olive skin and dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. She stood at the edge of his slip, holding a small leather purse and wearing the kind of careful composure that set off every alarm Raphael had spent 11 years trying to silence. "We're booked today," he said without looking up from the tackle he was organizing. Something about her presence felt wrong, not dangerous exactly, but significant in ways he couldn't identify. "Can take you out tomorrow morning if you want." "I'm not here for fishing." Her accent carried traces of Cuban Spanish buried beneath careful American diction. "I'm here about Rafael Mendoza." The tackle box slipped from Raphael's hands, lures scattering across Libertad's deck like brilliant fish scales. Time compressed into a single moment of recognition and terror. The name he'd buried beneath 11 years of careful performance hung in the salt air like an accusation. He kept his back turned, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run, to disappear, to become someone else entirely. Instead, he crouched slowly to collect the scattered lures, buying time his mind desperately needed. "Never heard of him," Raphael said, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "You might want to try the Coast Guard station. They keep records of missing persons." When he finally turned to face her, the young woman was smiling. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "My name is Isabella Castro," she said, "and you and I need to talk." The name hit Raphael like a physical blow. Castro. The syllables carried the weight of empire and revolution, of cigars and midnight executions, of the man who had shaped his entire existence and whom he had ultimately destroyed through betrayal. But this couldn't be possible. Fidel had died in 2016. Raphael had watched the funeral on television from this very boat, feeling an unexpected hollow grief for the man he'd called father before becoming his Judas. "I don't know what game you're playing," Raphael said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded rooms full of intelligence officers. The old Rafael Mendoza leaked through despite 11 years of careful burial. "But you've got the wrong person." Isabella's smile widened, revealing perfect teeth that somehow made her expression more predatory than pleasant. She reached into her leather purse with movements so deliberate that Raphael's hand instinctively moved toward the knife he kept clipped to his belt. Old instincts died hard. 11 years, 3 months, and 16 days, she said, withdrawing not a weapon but a small digital recorder. "That's how long you've been Robert Martinez, charter boat captain, fishing guide to tourists who think they're adventurous. 11 years since you disappeared from Marina Hemingway with $2 million CIA and a hard drive full of state secrets." The dock seemed to tilt beneath Raphael's feet. Around them, Key West's morning continued its normal rhythm. Eduardo Santos calling to other fishermen, seagulls fighting over bait scraps, the distant sound of Maria's laughter drifting across the water. But Isabella Castro had just detonated a bomb in the middle of his carefully constructed sanctuary. "You have 5 seconds to get off my boat," Raphael said, but his voice carried less conviction than it had moments before. The recorder in her hand seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "Before you do anything precipitous," Isabella said, pressing a button on the device, "you should hear this." Raphael's own voice filled the salt air, speaking in rapid Spanish to his CIA handler. "The Hialeah cell is compromised. Castro's planning raids for Thursday night. Eduardo Santos is the primary target. He's been running weapons to the underground since 1987. They have his address, his boat registration, everything. The blood drained from Rafael's face. That conversation had taken place in a Miami safe house 3 months before his extraction. Eduardo Santos, the man who'd just offered to take him fishing, who'd shared coffee and stories and fragments of exile wisdom for 6 years, Rafael had saved Eduardo's life by warning the CIA about Castro's planned raids. But now, that same evidence could destroy everything. "Where did you get this?" Rafael's voice was barely a whisper. "My grandfather kept extensive records," Isabella said, clicking off the recorder. "Thousands of hours of surveillance, intercepted communications, intelligence reports. He knew about your betrayal for months before you escaped. The question isn't where I got this. The question is what I plan to do with it." Rafael's mind raced through calculations and possibilities. If Castro had known, why had he been allowed to escape? If recordings existed, how many other conversations had been captured? How many other members of the exile community were mentioned in those files? "What do you want?" he asked. Isabella settled herself on Libertad's gunwale, as if she belonged there, her movements carrying an eerie echo of her grandfather's casual assumption of power. "I want you to understand that your comfortable little exile is ending today. Every person you saved by betraying Cuba, Eduardo, Maria, the Hernandez family who run the grocery store, old Carmen who makes the best Café Cubano in Key West, all of them are about to discover that their protection came at the cost of state treason. You can't prove any connection between—" "I can prove everything." Isabella's voice carried absolute certainty. "I have recordings of you feeding information to the CIA about 17 different resistance operations. I have photographs of documents you stole from my grandfather's office. I have financial records showing CIA payments deposited in your Cayman Islands account. Most importantly, I have a complete list of every Cuban-American family in South Florida that you helped save." The implications crashed over Rafael like a rogue wave. The exile community's protection had always depended on their invisibility, their ability to blend into American society while maintaining their resistance networks. If their connection to his intelligence work became public knowledge, every family would become a target for whatever remained of Castro's intelligence apparatus. "The old man's been dead for 7 years, Rafael said desperately. "This doesn't matter anymore." "Revolution doesn't die with one man," Isabella replied. "There are people in Havana who would pay handsomely for this information. There are also people in Miami who would kill to keep it buried. And there are certainly people in Washington who would eliminate anyone whose exposure might compromise ongoing operations." Rafael realized with crystal clarity that his 11 years of peace were over. Isabella Castro hadn't come to expose him. She'd come to own him. The girl held enough evidence to destroy not just his new life, but the lives of everyone he'd protected through his betrayal. "What do you want?" he asked again. Isabella stood, smoothing her dress with movements that reminded Rafael uncomfortably of her grandfather's theatrical gestures. "I want you to help me finish what Fidel started," she said. "I want you to help me destroy every last trace of the network you died to protect." The words hung between them like poison gas, and Rafael found himself struggling to breathe. Help her destroy the network he'd sacrificed everything to protect? The absurdity of it made him want to laugh, but the recorder in Isabella's hands had stolen his capacity for humor. "You're insane," he said, stepping back until his shoulders hit the cabin wall. "I won't help you hurt these people. Won't you?" Isabella tilted her head with predatory curiosity. "Even if refusing means watching them all burn anyway?" Rafael's hands trembled as he reached for his coffee mug, desperate for something normal to anchor himself. The liquid had gone cold, bitter as his suddenly racing thoughts. This couldn't be happening. Castro was dead. The revolution was crumbling. Cuba was becoming just another Caribbean island struggling with poverty and tourism. The old vendettas were supposed to die with the old men who'd nursed them. "I need time to think," he said. "You have 24 hours. Isabella slipped the recorder back into her purse with casual precision. "Tomorrow morning? Same time, you'll tell me yes. because the alternative is that these recordings find their way to some very dangerous people who won't be as reasonable as I am." She turned to leave, then paused at the dock's edge. "Oh, and Raphael? Don't try to run. Don't try to warn anyone. Don't try to be a hero. We've been watching you for months. Every friend you've made here, every routine you've established, every place you feel safe, we know about it all." After she disappeared into the maze of boats and tourists, Raphael stood frozen on Libertad's deck. His sanctuary had become a trap, and every familiar sight now carried the weight of surveillance. Was Eduardo's morning wave really friendly greeting, or had the old man noticed something? Was Maria's concern about his appearance genuine worry or careful observation? The paranoia felt like slipping into clothes that still fit perfectly after 11 years in storage. Raphael forced himself through the motions of preparing for the Henderson family charter. His hands worked automatically, checking life jackets, organizing rods, testing the fish finder, while his mind churned through impossible scenarios. Running meant abandoning the community he'd protected. Staying meant Isabella owned him completely. Fighting back meant what? He was one man against an organization that had apparently been patient enough to wait 11 years for revenge. When the Hendersons arrived at noon, their cheerful enthusiasm felt like mockery. The father, Jim, pumped Raphael's hand with Midwest friendliness, while his twin sons bounced with teenage energy. Their mother, Susan, worried about sunscreen and seasickness with maternal devotion that reminded Raphael painfully of families he'd helped tear apart during his intelligence career. "Beautiful day for fishing," Jim said, admiring Libertad's clean lines and well-maintained equipment. "You've got a nice operation here, Captain." 11 years building it, Raphael replied, the words carrying more weight than his customer could understand. As they motored out of Key West Harbor, Raphael caught himself scanning other boats for surveillance. The cigarette boat anchored near the reef. Were those tourists or watchers? The fishing charter that had launched 30 minutes ahead of them, coincidence or coordination? Every vessel became suspect, every face a potential threat. The Hendersons caught 3 decent-sized mahi-mahi and a small sailfish, their excitement genuine and infectious despite Raphael's distraction. Watching Jim teach his sons to fight the fish, seeing Susan's pride in her family's small victories, Raphael felt the weight of what Isabella was threatening. These people represented everything he'd sacrificed his identity to protect. Normal lives lived without fear, families building memories instead of planning escapes. During the return trip, his radio crackled with familiar voices. Eduardo checking in from his position near the reef. Maria coordinating with other guides about fish locations. The comfortable chatter of his chosen community oblivious to the storm gathering around them. Back at the dock, Raphael helped the Hendersons with their catch and accepted their generous tip with numb gratitude. After they left, he sat alone on Libertad's stern, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The golden hour that usually brought him peace now felt like a countdown to catastrophe. Eduardo appeared at his slip around 6, carrying 2 beers and wearing the expression of a man with something to say. "You look like hell, Bobby," Eduardo said, settling onto the dock with a grunt. "Something's eating at you." Raphael accepted the beer but didn't drink. How could he explain that his past had returned to devour their future? How could he tell this good man that his safety depended on secrets that were no longer secret? "Just tired," Raphael said. The lie tasted like ash. Eduardo studied him with eyes that had seen revolution, exile, and loss. "In Cuba, before everything went to hell, we learned to recognize when trouble was coming. The air changes. People start acting different. You get a feeling in your stomach like something's hunting you." The beer bottle slipped from Raphael's nerveless fingers, shattering against Libertad's deck. Eduardo's words had captured exactly the dread that had been building since Isabella's visit. Something was hunting him, something patient and implacable that had waited 11 years to strike. "Bobby," Eduardo said quietly, "whatever's coming, you don't have to face it alone." Raphael wanted to believe him. But the recorder's accusations echoed in his memory, and tomorrow's deadline approached with the inevitability of a hurricane making landfall. The shattered glass caught the dying light like scattered tears. Raphael stared at the fragments, seeing in them the reflection of his own fractured existence. 11 years of careful construction, destroyed by a young woman with her grandfather's eyes and a digital recorder full of ghosts. Bobby? Eduardo's voice carried genuine concern. What's really going on? Raphael knelt to collect the larger pieces, grateful for the excuse to avoid Eduardo's penetrating gaze. Each shard reminded him of another truth he couldn't speak, that Eduardo's name was on those recordings, that his escape from Castro's midnight raids had come at the cost of Raphael's soul, that tomorrow's sunrise might bring the end of everything they'd built in exile. Remember when you first got here? Eduardo continued, apparently taking Raphael's silence as invitation to fill it. 6 years ago, you looked like a man running from something that was going to catch him eventually. Same look you got right now. Raphael's hand closed around a piece of glass, the sharp edge biting into his palm. The pain felt appropriate, a small penance for the betrayals that had made Eduardo's freedom possible. Blood mixed with beer and seawater on Libertad's deck, and Raphael wondered if this was how confession was supposed to feel. You ever wonder, Raphael said carefully, what happens to the people who helped you get out of Cuba? Eduardo's weathered face grew thoughtful every day. Why? Just thinking about the cost of things. Raphael wrapped his bleeding palm in his shirt, the white fabric blooming crimson. How many people paid for our safety without knowing it? That kind of thinking will drive you crazy, hermano. Eduardo leaned back against the dock pilings, his beer forgotten. Revolution is like a hurricane, destroys everything in its path, guilty and innocent together. All we can do is build something better with what's left. But what if the hurricane wasn't finished? What if it had just been gathering strength, waiting for the perfect moment to complete its destruction? Raphael watched Eduardo's face in the fading light, memorizing the peace there, the contentment of a man who believed his running days were over. Eduardo, Raphael began, then stopped. How could he explain that Isabella Castro wasn't just threatening him, that the recordings contained enough information to unravel the entire South Florida exile network, that every family's address, every safe house, every resistance contact was cataloged in her grandfather's files like specimens in a museum of betrayal? You want to know something funny? Eduardo said, misinterpreting Raphael's hesitation. For months after I got to Miami, I kept expecting them to come for me. Every knock on the door, every phone call, every stranger who looked too interested, I thought it was the end. But you know what? Nobody came. It was like God himself had made me invisible. Not God, Raphael thought. Rafael Mendoza, intelligence officer for the Dirección de Inteligencia, feeding information to the CIA about Castro's planned operations, warning them which exiles to evacuate, which safe houses to abandon, which resistance cells to disband before the midnight raids could claim them, playing both sides against the middle until he could choose which side to die for. Maybe somebody was watching out for you, Raphael said, the words scraping his throat raw. Maybe. Eduardo studied Raphael's face with uncomfortable intensity. Or maybe somebody was watching out for all of us. You ever think about that? How many of us made it out when the odds said we should all be dead? Too many. That was the problem Isabella had identified with surgical precision. The exile community's survival rate had been statistically impossible without inside information. Someone had been feeding intelligence to the Americans, and the pattern was clear enough for Castro's granddaughter to reconstruct 30 years later. Raphael's phone buzzed against his hip. A text message from an unknown number, 23 hours, 12 minutes. Don't disappoint me. Bad news? Eduardo asked, noting Raphael's expression. Just a customer confirming tomorrow's charter. The lie came automatically, but it felt different now, heavier, more consequential. Each deception was another step away from the man Eduardo thought he knew, another betrayal of the friendship that had sustained Raphael through 6 years of careful hiding. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Other boats were heading in for the night, their captains calling familiar greetings across the water. Maria's voice carried from the adjacent slip, arguing with her engine in rapid Spanish. The sounds of his chosen family, oblivious to the fact that their protection had always been an illusion. You know what I learned in Cuba? Eduardo said, standing and finishing his beer. The worst thing about fear isn't being afraid. It's being afraid alone. He clasped Raphael's shoulder with calloused hands that had pulled nets and mended engines and built a new life from the wreckage of revolution. Whatever's hunting you, Bobby, it's hunting all of us. We survive together, or we don't survive at all. After Eduardo left, Raphael sat in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the evidence of everything he stood to lose. Tomorrow, he would have to choose between protecting his community and destroying them. Isabella Castro had constructed the perfect trap. There was no option that didn't end in betrayal. The darkness felt heavier tonight, pressing down on Raphael like the weight of 11 years' worth of carefully buried truths. He sat on Libertad's deck until the marina grew quiet, until the last tourists stumbled back to their hotels, and the only sounds were waves lapping against hulls and the distant hum of Key West's perpetual party. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of Havana, not the crumbling city he'd left behind, but the gleaming capital of his youth, when revolution had felt like salvation and betrayal wore the uniform of righteousness. He woke at 4 a.m. with Isabella's words echoing in his head, "We've been watching you for months." Coffee tasted like copper pennies. His hands shook as he checked weather reports and boat systems, going through the motions of another normal day that would never come. The Henderson charter seemed like a lifetime ago instead of yesterday afternoon. Everything before Isabella's arrival had become prologue to this moment. At dawn, Raphael walked the docks with new eyes. How many of the early rising fishermen were actually fishermen? The jogger who ran the same route every morning, had she always been there? The maintenance worker checking electrical boxes, was that really his job, or was he installing surveillance equipment? Paranoia was an old friend, and Raphael slipped back into its embrace with muscle memory that 11 years hadn't erased. He'd survived Castro's intelligence apparatus by trusting no one completely, believing nothing without verification, and always having 3 different escape routes planned. But this time felt different. This time, he was the one being hunted. Isabella arrived precisely at 8 a.m., wearing white again, a different dress, but the same calculated innocence. She carried a leather portfolio instead of the simple purse, and her smile held notes of triumph that made Raphael's stomach clench. "You look tired, Raphael," she said, settling onto Libertad's deck like she owned it. "I hope you use the time to think productively." "I thought," Raphael said. His voice sounded rusty, unpracticed. "But I need to understand something first. Why wait 11 years? If your grandfather knew about my betrayal, why let me escape at all?" Isabella's laugh was crystalline, musical, and wrong somehow, like a funeral dirge played in major key. "Oh, Raphael, you still think this is about punishment, don't you?" She opened the portfolio, revealing photographs that made Raphael's blood freeze. Pictures of Eduardo loading supplies into his truck, Maria arguing with her insurance company, the Hernandez family at their grandson's quinceañera, Carmen serving coffee to morning regulars. All of his chosen family, captured in moments of ordinary vulnerability. "My grandfather understood something you never did," Isabella continued, arranging the photographs like tarot cards predicting disaster. "Punishment is temporary, suffering ends, but guilt is eternal, especially when it's earned." Raphael reached for the pictures, but Isabella pulled them back. "You see, he could have executed you. Could have made you disappear into La Cabana Fortress like thousands of others, but that would have been mercy compared to what he actually planned." The morning sun felt cold against Raphael's skin. "What are you talking about?" "He wanted you to live with the knowledge that everyone you saved would eventually pay the price for your betrayal. He wanted you to build a new family, grow to love them, depend on their friendship, and then watch them burn because of choices you made decades ago." Isabella leaned forward, her young face animated with inherited malice. "Every happy moment you've had here, every friendship you've cherished, every peaceful sunset, all of it was borrowed time. The bill was always going to come due." Raphael's mind reeled. The escape route that had felt like salvation. Had it been orchestrated? The documents that had fallen into his hands at exactly the right moment. The contact who'd provided American intelligence coordinates. The boat that had waited at precisely the right coordinates. How much had been real and how much had been theater? "You're lying," he whispered. But even as he spoke, memories were shifting, taking on new and terrible significance. The ease of his extraction, the completeness of his new identity, the way everything had fallen into place so perfectly. Am I? Isabella pulled out another photograph, this one older, grainy. Raphael recognized it immediately, himself at 28, in his intelligence officer uniform, shaking hands with a CIA contact in a Miami hotel room. But the angle was wrong, shot from above like surveillance footage. This was taken 6 months before your supposed betrayal. My grandfather knew about your American connections from the beginning. The world tilted sideways. If Castro had known about the CIA meetings, if the whole thing had been monitored, then everything Raphael thought he'd accomplished, every life he'd believed he'd saved, might have been allowed to happen for reasons he'd never understood. The recordings, Raphael said desperately. The intelligence I passed. Oh, that was all real, Isabella said. My grandfather needed the resistance networks to trust you completely. He needed your betrayal to be authentic, documented, unforgivable. Otherwise, how could he be certain you'd suffer properly when the truth finally came out? She stood, smoothing her white dress with movements that now seemed less like innocence and more like ceremony. The old man always said the perfect revenge takes a lifetime to unfold. He died knowing you'd eventually face this choice: watch everyone you love burn, or light the match yourself. Raphael stared at the photographs scattered across Libertad's deck. All these lives, all these people who trusted him, who had no idea their safety had always been an illusion orchestrated by a dead dictator's patient malice. 23 hours are up, Raphael, Isabella said softly. Time to choose. Raphael's hands trembled as he gathered the photographs, each image a dagger twisted deeper into wounds he'd thought had healed. The morning breeze carried the scent of salt and diesel fuel, normal marina smells that now felt contaminated by Isabella's presence. What exactly are you asking me to do? He said, though he already knew. The trap was perfect in its symmetry, Castro's final masterpiece of psychological warfare. Isabella retrieved a manila envelope from her portfolio, setting it on the deck between them like a poisoned chalice. Inside are confession letters, 3 copies, one to the Miami Herald, one to Homeland Security, one to the Cuban Exile Leadership Council. All you have to do is sign them. Raphael didn't touch the envelope. And if I refuse, then the recordings go public tomorrow. Every conversation, every meeting, every piece of intelligence you pass to your American handlers. Her voice carried the patient certainty of someone holding all the cards. Do you know what happens to collaborators in Little Havana, Raphael? How they deal with traitors who sold out the resistance? He knew. The exile community's justice was swift and absolute. They'd found other betrayers over the years, men who'd fed information to Castro's agents, women who'd sold out escape routes. The lucky ones had simply disappeared. The unlucky ones had become cautionary tales whispered in coffee shops and community centers. But my confession protects them, Isabella continued. If you take responsibility, admit your guilt publicly, the focus stays on you. The families you helped escape become victims of your deception rather than accomplices to your betrayal. Raphael's phone buzzed. A text from Eduardo. Coffee at Maria's in an hour? Something I want to discuss. The irony was suffocating. His best friend wanted to share morning coffee while Raphael decided whether to destroy both their lives with the truth or sacrifice himself to preserve Eduardo's ignorance. You're assuming I care more about my reputation than their safety, Raphael said. I'm counting on it. Isabella's smile held echoes of her grandfather's legendary cruelty. Because the alternative isn't just exposure, Raphael, it's prosecution. Did you really think the statute of limitations protected you from treason charges? Especially when we have documented proof of your intelligence activities? The envelope seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Raphael could picture the headlines, Castro spy lived among us for decades. Local fishing captain exposed as Cuban intelligence agent. The betrayer of Key West. How long do I have? The confession needs to be submitted by 6 p.m. today. That gives the evening news cycle time to break the story properly. Isabella checked her phone with casual efficiency. I've already drafted press releases for maximum impact. Rafael thought about Eduardo's weathered hands teaching him to splice rope, Maria's fierce protectiveness when tourist customers got too demanding, Carmen's homemade flan delivered without explanation after particularly rough days on the water. 11 years of genuine friendship built on a foundation of lies. "What happens to you after this?" he asked. "Once you've destroyed everything your grandfather wanted destroyed?" For the first time, Isabella's composure flickered. Something vulnerable passed across her features before the mask reasserted itself. "That's not your concern." But Rafael had spent too many years reading people to miss the tell. "This isn't just about revenge, is it? You need this confession for something else, something personal." Isabella's jaw tightened. "Sign the papers, Rafael. You're being used too." The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone else is pulling your strings, just like Castro pulled mine. Who really wants this confession? Who benefits from destroying the exile network's trust in each other? "Sign the fucking papers." Isabella's mask slipped completely, revealing rage and desperation in equal measure. "You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed spending months watching you play happy fisherman while my father rotted in a Havana grave?" There it was, the personal wound driving everything else. Rafael's memory conjured faces from his intelligence files, trying to match them to Isabella's features. "What was your father's name?" "Miguel Santos." The words came out like broken glass. "You gave the Americans his location in 1987. They passed it to their exile contacts, who passed it to the resistance cell he was trying to infiltrate. He was 24 years old." Rafael closed his eyes, remembering. Miguel Santos, young and idealistic, working undercover to expose a weapons smuggling operation. Rafael had suspected the cell was compromised, had warned his CIA handler that any agent inside was walking into a death trap. The Americans had supposedly used the information to extract their own assets. They'd never mentioned sacrificing a Cuban intelligence officer to maintain their cover. "I didn't know," Rafael whispered. "Neither did he." Isabella's voice broke on the words. "He thought he was serving his country, just like you thought you were serving yours." The envelope lay between them like a contract written in blood, the final payment on a debt that had been accumulating interest for 37 years. Rafael reached for it with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. 6 p.m., Isabella said, standing. "Don't make me come looking for you." After she left, Rafael sat surrounded by the detritus of 2 lifetimes' worth of betrayal, holding the instrument of his own destruction. Rafael tore open the envelope with fingers that had grown steady in the face of absolute ruin. The confession letters were professionally drafted, clinical in their precision. Each word had been chosen to maximize damage while maintaining legal credibility. His entire life reduced to 3 pages of typed betrayal. But Isabella had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed Rafael still thought like the frightened intelligence officer who'd fled Cuba 11 years ago. She couldn't know that Key West had taught him something Castro's regime never had. The difference between surviving and living was often measured in the people willing to stand beside you when everything fell apart. Rafael walked to Maria's cafe, carrying the unsigned confession in his jacket pocket like a loaded weapon. The morning crowd was gathering, Eduardo at his usual corner table, the Hernandez brothers arguing about baseball over café con leche, Carmen reviewing receipts with the focused intensity she brought to everything that mattered, his family, not by blood or ideology, but by choice and time and shared storms weathered together. "Bobby," Eduardo waved him over. "You look like hell. Late night?" Rafael sat down, studying Eduardo's face, weathered by sun and salt, marked by 63 years of loss and hope and stubborn resilience. In a few hours, this man might learn that his closest friend had been living a lie since the day they met. But right now, in this moment, Eduardo's concern was genuine and uncomplicated. "I need to tell you something," Rafael said. "Coffee first, confessions later." Eduardo signaled Carmen, who brought 2 cups without being asked. The simple gesture, friends who knew each other's rhythms, felt like absolution Rafael didn't deserve. Rafael pulled out the confession letters, spreading them across the scarred wooden table. Eduardo's eyebrows rose as he scanned the first page, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something Rafael couldn't identify. "Jesus Christ, Bobby. Eduardo's voice dropped to a whisper. This is true. All of it. Rafael's throat felt raw. My real name is Rafael Mendoza. I was an intelligence officer under Castro. I fed information to the CIA about planned operations against the exile community, and yesterday, someone from my past came to collect the debt. Eduardo set down his coffee cup with excessive care, like a man trying not to break something precious. How long have you known? About the confession, I mean. Since yesterday morning. Isabella Castro, she's not really Castro's granddaughter, but she carries his legacy. She has recordings that could destroy dozens of families. Unless I sign this and take full responsibility, she goes public with everything. Rafael watched Eduardo's face, waiting for the explosion of betrayal and rage. Instead, Eduardo leaned back in his chair and laughed, a sound like waves breaking against rocks. You magnificent bastard, Eduardo said. Do you have any idea how many of us suspected? The world tilted again, but in a different direction. What? Bobby, you think we're idiots? A man shows up in Key West speaking perfect Spanish, knows every detail about Cuban intelligence operations, has enough money to buy a boat but claims he's a refugee? Eduardo's eyes were bright with something between amusement and affection. Maria had you figured out in 6 months. Rafael's carefully constructed reality cracked like ice in sunlight. You knew? We knew you were running from something. We knew you'd been on the inside of whatever hell you escaped from. And we knew. Eduardo leaned forward, his voice becoming fierce with protective loyalty, that whatever you'd done before, you were one of us now. Carmen appeared at their table, setting down a plate of fresh pastries. Eduardo's making speeches again, she said. Must be serious. Carmen, Eduardo said, Bobby has something to tell you. About his past. Carmen studied Rafael's face with the same intensity she brought to balancing accounts. You're Rafael Mendoza, she said matter-of-factly. Intelligence officer, fled Cuba in 2013. The question is, are you planning to sign those papers, or are we going to handle this like family? Rafael stared at her. How long have you... Since the beginning. You think I serve coffee to people for 40 years without learning to read them? Carmen pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. The real question is whether you trust us enough to let us help, or if you're going to martyr yourself for some misguided notion of protecting us from consequences we accepted years ago. Through the cafe window, Rafael could see Isabella waiting by the marina, checking her phone with increasing agitation. She expected him to arrive at 6 o'clock with signed papers and a broken spirit, ready to trade his life for his friend's safety. Instead, Rafael looked around the table at faces that had known the truth all along and chosen love over judgment, loyalty over safety. She has recordings, he said, evidence that could send people to prison. Eduardo's smile was sharp as a blade. Then I guess we better make sure she doesn't get the chance to use them. For the first time in 37 years, Rafael Mendoza stopped running. The confrontation with Isabella lasted exactly 11 minutes. Rafael timed it on his watch, a habit from his intelligence days that 37 years hadn't broken. She was waiting at the marina as expected, the manila envelope containing his unsigned confession clutched in her manicured hands like a prayer book. Behind her, the Gulf stretched endlessly toward Cuba, the same waters Rafael had crossed in terror 11 years ago. You're late, Isabella said, though it was only 5:47 p.m. I'm not signing. Rafael's voice carried across the water with surprising steadiness. And you're not releasing those recordings. Isabella's composure cracked like thin ice. You don't understand what I understand, Rafael interrupted, is that you're Miguel Santos's daughter, not Castro's granddaughter. You're 26 years old, born in Miami, and you've spent your entire life carrying anger that belongs to someone else. The color drained from Isabella's face. Behind Rafael, he could hear footsteps on the dock. Eduardo, Carmen, Maria, and a dozen others from the cafe, moving with the quiet purpose of people protecting their own. The recordings, Isabella whispered, were destroyed 3 hours ago. Eduardo's voice carried the satisfied tone of a man who'd solved a particularly challenging puzzle. Amazing what Cuban exile networks can accomplish when they work together. Your contact in Miami, Carlos Mendez? He sends his regards. and his resignation from whatever organization thought they could use a dead man's granddaughter to settle old scores. Raphael watched Isabella's carefully constructed world collapse in real time. The puppet master who'd been pulling her strings had cut them loose the moment their plan failed, leaving her alone with 30 years of manufactured grief. "My father," she said, the words barely audible. "Died serving his country," Raphael replied. "Just like I thought I was serving mine. The people who got him killed, who got all of us caught in this web, they're the ones who should answer for it. Not you, not anymore." Isabella stared at the unsigned confession, then at the envelope, then at the water that had carried so much pain between two countries that couldn't stop wounding each other. "I don't know who I am without this anger," she admitted. Carmen stepped forward, her grandmother's instincts overriding decades of political complexity. "Then maybe it's time to find out." 6 months later, Raphael stood on Libertad's deck, watching the sun paint Key West Harbor in shades of gold and crimson. The morning charter had been perfect, dolphins playing in the boat's wake, tourists delighted by the abundance of yellowtail, Eduardo telling stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. The FBI investigation had lasted 2 weeks. Raphael's cooperation, combined with testimonies from the exile community and evidence Eduardo's contacts had provided, had shifted the focus to the real perpetrators, a shadowy network of intelligence operatives from 3 different countries who'd been using old wounds to settle new scores. Isabella had testified too, her reluctant honesty helping to unravel 30 years of manipulation and betrayal. She'd returned to Miami afterward, enrolling in graduate school and slowly learning to carry her father's memory without being crushed by it. Raphael's phone buzzed with a text from her, starting therapy next week. "Thought you should know." He typed back, "Proud of you. Coffee sometime?" "Maybe. When I'm ready to remember him as he was, not as who I needed him to be." The response felt like forgiveness. Not complete, perhaps not permanent, but genuine. "Deep thoughts?" Eduardo asked, emerging from the cabin with 2 beers, and the comfortable assumption of welcome that defined their friendship. "Just thinking about names," Raphael replied, accepting the cold bottle. "I've been Raphael, Bobby, traitor, spy, friend. Strange how we become all these different people while staying exactly the same." Eduardo settled into the chair beside him, their evening ritual as established as the tides. "You know what I call you?" "What's that?" "Home." Eduardo's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent too many years displaced. "This place, these people, we're all refugees from something. Some of us ran from governments, some from families, some from versions of ourselves we couldn't live with anymore. But we stopped running when we found each other." The sun touched the horizon, setting the gulf ablaze with reflected light. In a few minutes the cafe crowd would gather for dinner, arguments about baseball and politics flowing as freely as the wine. Carmen would insist on cooking too much food. Maria would complain about tourist customers while secretly delighting in their stories, and Raphael would sit among them knowing he belonged somewhere at last. Not because he'd escaped his past, but because he'd finally learned to carry it without being destroyed by its weight. Castro's revenge had been perfect in its conception but flawed in its execution. The dictator had understood guilt and isolation, manipulation and fear. But he'd never grasped the transformative power of unconditional acceptance, the way chosen family could absorb even the deepest betrayals and somehow alchemize them into wisdom. The last light faded from the water, and Rafael Mendoza, spy, traitor, friend, went home to the people who'd saved his life by loving him exactly as he was.